Cool, so let's take a look at this nice videoBox component. I start with index.sx. I can see here that it's basically re-exporting a bunch of things from these files. So I'll dive into the videoBox, call right off the bat, styled video. Looking at the props, so video source URL sounds good. Width and height are in string. I assume this is because you might want to specify CSS values for this, like at 100% and not just pixel values. It would be nice to explain the title of the video, where it's going to be displayed. With this sort of documentation stuff, it's kind of obvious from the property itself of what it does, so I recommend putting stuff that is not obvious, like whatever, whenever, like where the video title and why it's important. I think you're doing a good job here with the placing line. It explains that on mobile the behavior is a little different. So muted, loop, autoplay. The thing about this is that it's unclear what are the default values. I scroll to the bottom and you also don't have the default values here, so I assume you rely on Boolean coalescing logic, and it works well because autoplay by default being falsy kind of makes sense, the same for muted and loop. But I recommend being more explicit here and specifying the default values either here or using react.default props, or like setting the default props property on this component. Cool, so here we have the initial state. This is interesting. So your muted is true by default, but then you have muted here as a prop. So it's unclear to me how it's used. Muted, so here we have this, and then state.muted. Okay, so I see, so it's gonna end up in the props, and the props will go to the video container, but not the video player. So this, I assume this muted as a prop, it just doesn't work. So no matter what you set it to, the video mute is going to be controlled via the internal state. And here you have the sort of the classical problem of controlled versus uncontrolled component, where if you choose to store muted inside of the component, then having it also as a prop will create a lot of confusion, where the parent component, for example, maybe there is a button somewhere on the web page that based on that it's going to set muted on the video box. However, because it stores its own value of muted, it will have no effect. So we would have to design this slightly differently if you wanted to handle this case. And if not, which is totally fine, just remove this from the list of props. I like the use of reducer and effect here. The reducer will take a look at this layer, but it takes care of the state transitioning logic, and the use effect basically synchronizes that state to the video ref. One kind of minor thing to note here is that when you set value like this, every time this component renders, the value technically is going to be different because it's a different object recreated on every render. That means all your consumers will re-render as well. It's fine, I guess, because the component hierarchy is not that deep, but in a different example where it's the depth of the component is large and you use a lot of consumers of this value, you might want to throw use memo here. Cool, so you spread props in here, which are the rest props, and what are those? I recommend if you do this destructuring, list them in the same order you use the props, so that it's easier to scan, because for me now it's kind of hard to figure out what goes into the rest props. Again, I assume that you need this because this can be undefined. So if you use a custom default value, it will be simpler and will read easier. Also, what does it mean, right? If it's undefined, you will have border radius undefined, and I'm not sure what's the emotion behavior here. Will it attach the CSS, or will it ignore this property at all and remove it? Not sure. Children, you don't have any description of children's in the prop types. Oh, maybe it's in the box props, I see. However, this video container is... okay, so it is a box. So whatever goes in the children goes after the video player. It would be nice to document this, saying like children things will be rendered after the document, after the video. So maybe it's easier to imagine what the component looks like and what you can use the children for. Looking at the states, we have muted, and that's controlled here. So it's always muted. I wonder how, so it's never gonna change. Yeah, okay, so the reason I don't see a way to mute or unmute the video. You have the stories file here. I see, okay. So that kind of makes sense. You can render anything and then you dispatch these actions. Okay, makes sense. So you allow for the user of this component to render its own context consumer, and through that context you dispatch actions. Makes sense. Although I think this could be a good use case for use imperative handle to actually allow components to add ref to your component and call these methods instead of relying on the context provider. The other thing that I noticed is that in your docs, you allow dispatching these actions, which deal with the inner state of the component. So if I go to the reducers here, mouse enter and mouse leave, those are like internal states of your component. So I would assume you wouldn't want to allow others to trigger this, to dispatch these actions. Looking at the types here, I think if you were to pull it in a separate file, it would make sense to also include the state type. I see it's in the reducer. Cool, so overall, looks like nice work. Clearly you adhere to some standards here, separating things into separate files. You have documentation. I don't see anything terribly wrong with this code. My suggestions would be about documentation, making it more informative, figuring out what you want to do with the muted property, and if you want to make it controlled or uncontrolled. In this, the simplest way, I think, is to just remove this since it's unused, add default values for this thing so they are more explicit. And thinking about the context stuff, I actually kind of like this because inside of this video inside of the sort of when the user renders this video box, they can have their play and pause and other buttons to be relying on the context instead of passing the ref to the video player. So now that I look at this, I kind of like this design. I think this example could be a little better if you here, instead of returning the context API string, if you render like a button that does context.dispatch mute or pause or something like this, so it's clear how this thing can be useful. Also, I would recommend making these private in your APIs. It's hard to read. Oh, I see, you have the more complicated example here. It just didn't render properly in the GitHub's point of view. Overall, nice work. Hope this was helpful.